So a while ago I was at a party and someone turned to me and said,
"So what's the difference between plants and animals exactly? I mean, is it always possible to say which is which?"
And I'm like, okay, so would you like the long answer or the long answer? Our planet is filled with a bewildering array of living things, and people have been trying since forever to put them into groups to try and make sense of them. Some of the classics involve edible versus inedible, wild versus tame, and humans versus everything else. The humans always, for some reason, tend to end up on top and else on bottom. Most, if not all, of these early attempts are based on general observations of what an organism does and what it looks like.
Carl Linnaeus, father of modern taxonomy, split nature into three kingdoms.
The mineral kingdom, which forms the earth, the vegetable kingdom, which grows to cover it, and the animal kingdom, which moves freely through the other two. In ecology, we talk about functional groups, which is what role an organism plays in its ecosystem. I'm going to steal that term here and use it in a more inclusive sense. Functional classification schemes are very useful and easy for anyone to understand, but they run into problems rather quickly and have to be redefined. Take something as simple as animals move, plants don't. It sounds great, but this barnacle spends all its life stuck to a rock, and this Venus flytrap actually chomps things. Or take Euglena. Besides a possible name for my firstborn daughter, Euglena is a single-celled organism that swims around with a flagellum and lives off of sunlight like a plant. Lots of organisms do this, by the way. It's not even uncommon. Okay, fine, you might say. So animals are organisms that eat stuff, and plants are those that photosynthesize. Well, it's not that simple either, because Euglena is a mixotroph. It can both eat things and photosynthesize, depending on the circumstances. And this parasitic orchid has lost its chlorophyll and lives by sucking nutrients from the roots of other plants. And what do we call the fungi, which live not on sunlight, but by breaking down other organisms? We'll have to give them a kingdom of their own. But what about slime molds? Slime molds spend most of their time as single-celled amoeba-like things sliming about like animals. But when times get tough, they gang together and crawl through the undergrowth like a mobile fungus. And then they form a fungus-like stalk, and then they reproduce using spores. I mean, what? What do we even call that? It's not an animal, it's not a... Is that gonna have its own kingdom too? Is everything gonna have its own kingdom too now? The underlying problem here is that nature is complicated, but functional groups need to be simple in order to work, which means that they'll always be more or less arbitrary. And that leads us to the other way of classifying living things. With the power of evolutionary theory at their disposal, taxonomists realize that there's a different way of dealing with this mess. Because all life on Earth has evolved from some kind of common ancestor, we can group organisms not by what roles they play, but by how they're related. Like branches on an enormous family tree where all members of any given branch share a common ancestry. This was the advent of modern systematics, and it meant that for the first time we could start classifying things in a way that wasn't arbitrary or artificial, but natural. Of course, because we weren't actually there when the organisms evolved, we have to use a lot of detective work. Looking closely at their anatomy and genes, and changing the family tree around whenever we find new and better evidence. So how many kingdoms are there now? Well, it's complicated. If you took biology in high school, you may have been taught the five-kingdom system. The main thing you need to know about the five-kingdom system is that it sucks. It's terrible and it doesn't reflect reality, and everyone's known this for decades now. For example, Monera contained all single-celled creatures without a nucleus, but that turned out to mean bacteria and archaea, which are two groups more fundamentally unrelated to each other than you are to a cabbage. And then there's the clusterfuck of poor taxonomy that is Protista, a group containing vastly unrelated organisms that have nothing in common except that they don't obviously belong in any of the other groups. The only reason why the five-kingdom system is still being taught in schools is that science has been unable to agree on anything better. Six-kingdom systems, eight-kingdom systems, and systems that forgo the term kingdom altogether have all been proposed in the last few decades. Part of the problem is that a lot of organisms are very strange and obscure and have very few people studying them. And part of it is that some of the main branches on the tree of life formed a very long time ago, and it's really hard to interpret the evidence. On the other hand, smaller branches within those groups are sometimes quite clear, so systematics still allows us to get a very good idea of the diversity of life. As demonstration, let's return to this assortment of plants from earlier in the video. They all live on sunlight, and most people would simply call them plants, but they have very different ancestries. This rose is a vascular plant in Kingdom Plantae. Specifically, it's a member of the rose family, which means its closest relatives include strawberries and apple trees. This lichen isn't even one organism at all. It's a symbiotic cooperative venture by a fungus that forms the main body and an alga that provides the food. Our old friend Euglena belongs in the Kingdom Excavata, which means it's related to the vaginal parasite Trichomonas and to the parasite that causes beaver fever. And this seaweed is a brown alga, placing it in the kingdom Chromalveolata, which means that among much else it's related to... Actually, there's a good story, but it's a bit of a tangent, so I'll have to put it in a separate video. It's important to note that the fact that functional classification schemes predate modern systematics doesn't mean that they've fallen out of use. We all use them to describe nature on a daily basis. The word tree is actually a functional term. Systematically, trees aren't a single lineage. They're a lifestyle that's been invented over and over by dozens of different plant groups. So okay, now we have these two equally useful classification schemes. We can return to the original question of plants and animals. If we're speaking in functional terms, plant and animal are words that work well on a day-to-day level, but don't stand up to exceptions and do very little to describe the phenomenal diversity of living things. If we're speaking in systematic terms, then it's easy to say what's a plant or an animal and what isn't. Both kingdoms are very well defined by common ancestry. On the other hand, they leave out a whole mess of plant-like and animal-like groups that are hard to keep track of without a textbook. It all depends on what kind of biology you're trying to do, and whether you're the kind of person who likes to put things into neat boxes or the kind of person who wants to see what things do when you poke them. Thank you for watching!